There was a time when these voices ruled country radio. Their songs filled jukeboxes, sold out theaters, and shaped the sound of an era. For a brief moment, they were everywhere, on charts, on television, in the hearts of millions. But as the industry changed, their names slowly faded from the conversation. No farewell tours, no grand comebacks, just silence. This is the story of 9 once famous country singers no one talks about anymore, and how country music quietly moved on without them. For a stretch of time in the early 1980s, Eddy Raven was impossible to avoid on country radio. His songs carried a smooth, forward-looking sound that felt modern without abandoning country roots. At a moment when Nashville was cautiously flirting with crossover appeal, Raven seemed perfectly positioned. He was not an outlaw, not a traditionalist purist, and not a pop fabrication. He was something rare. A bridge. Raven's rise did not come overnight. Before his own stardom, he worked quietly behind the scenes as a songwriter, even co-writing Country Green for Waylon Jennings. That background shaped his career. When his solo success finally arrived, it came with discipline and intention. Between 1980 and 1988, he placed an extraordinary number of songs in the top 10, including major hits like I Got Mexico, Driving My Life Away, and Joe Knows How to Live. These were not novelty records. They were radio staples, played daily across America. At his peak, Eddy Raven was everywhere Nashville wanted him to be. Television appearances, national tours, steady chart success. Yet there was a quiet problem forming beneath the surface. His sound depended on balance. It worked only as long as country radio tolerated artists who sat in the middle. When the late 1980s arrived, that middle ground collapsed. The industry pivoted hard. On one side came the neo-traditionalists. On the other, a new generation of louder, image-driven stars. Raven belonged fully to neither. His music was suddenly labeled too soft for one crowd and not flashy enough for the other. Radio programmers stopped calling. Labels shifted attention elsewhere. There was no scandal, no meltdown, no dramatic fall. Just a slow closing of doors. Unlike many forgotten stars, Eddy Raven did not self-destruct. He continued writing, recording, and performing on a smaller scale. But the machine that once amplified his voice moved on without him. Over time, his name slipped out of documentaries, retrospectives, and casual conversations about country's past. Today, millions still recognize his songs without remembering the man who sang them. Eddy Raven did not fail country music. Country music simply outgrew the space he once occupied. Mel Street. Mel Street was never built for Nashville's spotlight, and that may be exactly why his music felt so honest. In an era dominated by polished images and marketable personalities, Street stood apart as a pure honky-tonk singer. His voice carried pain without exaggeration, heartbreak without theatrics. For listeners who lived the songs they heard, Mel Street sounded real. His rise came quietly in the early 1970s. While he never chased superstardom, Street earned deep respect within traditional country circles. Songs like Borrowed Angel and Lovin' on Backstreets became staples on country radio, resonating with working-class audiences who heard their own lives reflected in his lyrics. He charted consistently, earned invitations to the Grand Ole Opry, and was widely regarded as one of the genre's most authentic voices. But Mel Street's greatest strength was also his vulnerability. Behind the scenes, he battled severe depression and long-standing mental health struggles. At a time when such issues were neither openly discussed nor properly treated, the industry offered little support. Touring schedules were relentless. Expectations were quiet but heavy, and the emotional weight of singing heartbreak night after night took its toll. As the decade moved forward, country music began to shift. The sound grew cleaner, brighter, more commercially engineered. Artists were increasingly expected to sell optimism, not despair. Mel Street did not adapt because he could not. His music came from lived pain, not calculated image. Radio interest slowly cooled. Label support weakened. The invitations became less frequent. In 1978, at just 42 years old, Mel Street took his own life. There was no industry-wide reckoning, no serious conversation about mental health. His death was acknowledged briefly, then absorbed into silence. Nashville moved on quickly, as it often does. Today, Mel Street is rarely mentioned outside of hardcore traditionalist circles. His records are not celebrated in mainstream retrospectives. His name is absent from most modern country histories. Yet his influence lingers quietly in every honest country song that refuses to dress heartbreak in gloss. Mel Street did not disappear because he lacked talent or success. He disappeared because the industry had no room for pain that could not be packaged. Johnny Rodriguez. In the early 1970s, Johnny Rodriguez represented something country music had rarely seen before. A Mexican-American singer with a smooth, traditional voice, he broke through at a time when Nashville was still deeply conservative about image and identity. His success was not modest. It was overwhelming. For several years, Johnny Rodriguez was one of the most reliable hitmakers in country music. Between 1973 and 1978, he scored an astonishing run of #1 singles, including You Always Come Back to Hurting Me, Ridin' My Thumb to Mexico, and That's the Way Love Goes. His sound was firmly rooted in classic country, shaped by the influence of Merle Haggard, yet distinct enough to stand on its own. Radio embraced him. Audiences followed. For a moment, it felt like Rodriguez had permanently expanded the boundaries of who could succeed in country music. But the momentum did not last. As the decade closed, cracks began to show. The industry shifted once again, and Johnny Rodriguez found himself caught between eras. New stars emerged with fresher images, while labels became less patient with artists who required long-term development. At the same time, Rodriguez struggled with personal issues, including substance abuse, that quietly eroded his professional stability. The turning point came in the late 1990s with a highly publicized legal incident that, despite ultimately ending without a murder conviction, permanently damaged his public image. By then, his chart power had already faded, but the controversy sealed his disappearance from mainstream country narratives. Radio stopped mentioning his name. Industry celebrations omitted his contributions. The door closed completely. Unlike some forgotten artists, Johnny Rodriguez did not simply fade into anonymity. He continued performing, particularly for loyal fans who remembered his golden years. Yet his place in country history was increasingly minimized, as if his success had been an uncomfortable chapter the industry preferred not to revisit. Today, his run of #1 hits is rarely acknowledged outside of specialist discussions. For newer audiences, Johnny Rodriguez barely exists, and yet, his career once proved that country music could evolve without abandoning tradition. Johnny Rodriguez did not fail to belong. He arrived too early, carried too much weight, and was left behind when the industry chose convenience over memory. Sylvia. In the early 1980s, Sylvia was positioned as the future of female country crossover. Her voice was clear, emotional, and radio-friendly, perfectly suited for an era when Nashville was cautiously opening the door to pop influences. When her breakout hit Nobody exploded in 1982, it didn't just top the country charts. It crossed formats, dominated radio, and turned Sylvia into a household name almost overnight. For a brief period, everything aligned. She followed Nobody with a string of successful singles, earned major award nominations, and became a familiar face on television and award shows. Industry insiders saw her as proof that country could sound modern without losing credibility. She wasn't manufactured. She wasn't chasing trends. She simply fit the moment perfectly. But country music has always been unforgiving to artists whose success depends on timing. As the 1980s progressed, Nashville's priorities shifted again. Labels began demanding either harder traditionalism or more aggressive pop polish. Sylvia's sound lived in between. What once felt contemporary was now dismissed as soft. Radio support quietly weakened. Promotion slowed. Without warning, the momentum stopped. Unlike many of her male peers, Sylvia was given little room to experiment or fail. When her later releases underperformed, the industry did not adjust its strategy. It withdrew. Invitations dried up. The spotlight moved on to newer faces with louder images. Sylvia was still recording, still touring, still capable, but no longer considered essential. Behind the scenes, the emotional toll was heavy. Years later, Sylvia would speak openly about depression and the psychological impact of being erased by an industry she had once trusted. Her story reflected a pattern common to many women in country music, where success came fast, expectations were rigid, and support vanished the moment sales declined. Today, Nobody remains instantly recognizable, yet the artist behind it is rarely mentioned in conversations about country's evolution. Sylvia's name is often reduced to a single hit, stripped of the broader career that once made her one of Nashville's brightest stars. Sylvia did everything the industry asked of her. When the sound of country music changed, she was not allowed to change with it. She wasn't forgotten because she failed. She was forgotten because the system decided she was replaceable. T.G. Sheppard. For much of the late 1970s and early 1980s, T.G. Sheppard was not just successful, he was dominant. Few country artists in history enjoyed the kind of sustained chart power Sheppard commanded at his peak. Between 1975 and 1982, he delivered an extraordinary run of #1 hits, many of them consecutive, a level of consistency that placed him among the elite of his era. Songs like Devil in the Bottle, Last Cheater's Waltz, and I Loved 'Em Every One made Sheppard a fixture on country radio. His voice was confident, polished, and unmistakably commercial, perfectly aligned with Nashville's appetite at the time. He was everywhere the industry wanted a star to be: award shows, television appearances, national tours. For a moment, T.G. Sheppard felt permanent, but his success was built on a version of country music that proved fragile. As the 1980s advanced, the genre began to fracture. Neo-traditionalists pushed back against slick production, while younger audiences gravitated toward emerging pop country aesthetics. Sheppard's sound, once praised for its accessibility, suddenly felt dated to programmers eager to signal change. The shift was swift and largely silent. Radio support declined. Chart positions slipped. Labels redirected resources toward newer acts. There was no dramatic scandal, no personal collapse, no public controversy. Sheppard simply found himself on the wrong side of Nashville's evolving identity. Unlike artists who reinvented themselves, Sheppard remained loyal to the style that had brought him success. That loyalty came at a cost. While he continued recording and performing, his presence in mainstream country conversations steadily faded. Retrospectives began to overlook him. Younger audiences grew up unaware that he had once rivaled the biggest names of his generation. Today, T.G. Sheppard's achievements are rarely discussed outside of specialist circles. His string of #1 hits, once seen as historic, has been quietly overshadowed by louder narratives and more culturally convenient legacies. He did not disappear because he lacked relevance. He disappeared because his era became inconvenient to remember. T.G. Sheppard represents a particular truth about country music. Success does not guarantee permanence. Even dominance can be temporary when the industry decides to rewrite its own story. David Frizzell. For much of his career, David Frizzell lived in a space few artists escape. He was successful, respected, and widely heard, yet almost always defined in relation to someone else. As the younger brother of Lefty Frizzell, one of the most influential voices in country history, David entered Nashville carrying a legendary last name that opened doors and cast a long shadow at the same time. His breakthrough came in the late 1970s and early 1980s when he carved out a clear identity of his own. David Frizzell scored multiple top 10 hits and found massive success through duets, most notably with Shelley West. Songs like "You're the Reason God Made Oklahoma" became cultural staples, dominating radio and cementing his place in mainstream country. For a period, his voice was everywhere, familiar and trusted. Yet the way the industry framed his success quietly limited his legacy. David Frizzell was often presented as a compliment rather than a centerpiece. The duets were celebrated. The chart positions were acknowledged, but the narrative rarely centered on him as a defining solo force. Even at his peak, he was treated as secondary, a reliable presence, rather than a star the industry built around long-term. As country music shifted in the mid to late 1980s, Frizzell's momentum slowed. Radio tastes changed. Labels chased younger images and louder branding. Artists without a sharply defined persona were the first to be pushed aside. David Frizzell did not reinvent himself, nor did he chase trends. He continued recording, touring, and working steadily, but the spotlight moved elsewhere. Unlike many forgotten figures, Frizzell's disappearance was not dramatic. There was no collapse, no scandal, no sudden ending. His career simply narrowed. The venues grew smaller, the airplay stopped, and over time, his name became associated almost exclusively with a single duet, rather than the broader body of work that once kept him near the top of the charts. Today, David Frizzell is rarely mentioned in discussions about country music's defining voices, despite having been part of one of its most commercially successful eras. His story reveals how easily consistency can be mistaken for insignificance. David Frizzell did not fail to leave a mark. He was quietly written out of the story because he never fit the industry's preferred image of what a lasting star should look like. Jeannie Seely. Jeannie Seely entered country music at a time when female artists were expected to follow narrow rules. Voices could be strong, but personalities had to stay contained. Songs could be emotional, but rebellion was discouraged. From the beginning, Seely pushed against those limits. Her presence, both on record and on stage, carried a confidence that felt quietly defiant in 1960s Nashville. Her breakthrough came with Don't Touch Me in 1966, a song that earned her a Grammy Award and established her as one of country music's most distinctive female voices. Unlike many of her peers, Seely's delivery was conversational and emotionally complex. She sang heartbreak without fragility and independence without apology. Industry insiders recognized her talent immediately, and she became a regular fixture at the Grand Ole Opry. For years, Jeannie Seely worked steadily. She recorded consistently, toured relentlessly, and remained visible within country music's inner circles. Yet her career followed a pattern common to many women of her generation. While male contemporaries were allowed to evolve, age, and redefine themselves, Seely was quietly pushed into the background as newer female stars emerged with more commercially palatable images. The industry did not turn against her. It simply stopped prioritizing her. Radio airplay faded. Promotional budgets shrank. Invitations became less frequent. Seely remained active, but the narrative around her shifted from contemporary artist to legacy act far earlier than it should have. Unlike many artists who disappear entirely, Jeannie Seely never left country music. She continued performing at the Opry, writing songs, and supporting the genre from within. Yet her cultural visibility diminished. Younger audiences grew up unaware that she had once stood at the forefront of Nashville's creative evolution. Today, Jeannie Seely is often remembered as an Opry institution rather than a groundbreaking artist. Her influence on female expression in country music is rarely acknowledged in mainstream histories. The edge she once brought to the genre has been softened by time and selective memory. Jeannie Seely was not forgotten because she stopped contributing. She was forgotten because country music has often struggled to fully credit the women who helped reshape it. Billy Joe Shaver. Billy Joe Shaver was never designed to be a mainstream country star, and that contradiction defined his entire career. Within the outlaw movement of the 1970s, his name carried enormous weight, but rarely in the way the public understood stardom. He was not pushed as a polished frontman. He was the writer, the voice behind the voices, the man whose words gave outlaw country its raw, uncompromising spine. His breakthrough came not through chart dominance, but through influence. Shaver wrote songs that became cornerstones of the genre, most famously for Waylon Jennings on the album Honky Tonk Heroes. Lyrics like "I've been a long time leaving" and "Old Five and Dimers Like Me" captured a kind of working-class defiance that Nashville could not manufacture. Insiders knew it. Artists knew it. But the industry never quite knew what to do with him. As a solo artist, Billy Joe Shaver recorded steadily and earned critical respect, yet commercial success remained elusive. His voice was rough, his delivery unpolished. His songs demanded attention rather than offering comfort. While outlaw country briefly dominated headlines, the movement itself was eventually absorbed, diluted, and repackaged. Shaver remained exactly who he was, even as the spotlight shifted elsewhere. His personal life was marked by relentless hardship. Addiction, poverty, and profound loss followed him for decades. The death of his son, Eddy Shaver, himself a gifted guitarist, deepened the weight already embedded in his music. These experiences did not destroy Shaver's art, but they made it harder to sell in an industry increasingly driven by image and accessibility. By the time Americana and roots music found renewed appreciation decades later, Billy Joe Shaver was already positioned as a cult figure rather than a reclaimed star. Younger audiences discovered his songs through covers and documentaries, often without realizing he was still alive, still writing, still performing. He became legendary without ever becoming visible. When Billy Joe Shaver died in 2020, tributes poured in from fellow musicians, not from the mainstream industry. His influence was undeniable. His recognition? Limited. He was celebrated as a songwriter, a phrase that quietly acknowledges distance from fame. Billy Joe Shaver was not forgotten because he lacked importance. He was forgotten because his kind of truth was never meant to fit neatly into country music's commercial memory. Larry Gatlin. For a time in the late 1970s and early 1980s, Larry Gatlin stood at the center of one of country music's most successful vocal acts. As the frontman of the Gatlin brothers, his voice and songwriting powered a run of chart-topping hits that made the group a staple of American television, radio, and touring circuits. Their harmonies were instantly recognizable, their image polished, and their commercial appeal undeniable. Larry Gatlin's path to stardom was unconventional. Before his own success, he worked behind the scenes, writing songs for Elvis Presley and other major artists. That background gave him credibility within the industry and control over his artistic direction. When the Gatlin brothers broke through with songs like All the Gold in California and Broken Lady, Larry Gatlin was not just performing. He was shaping the sound and narrative of the group. At their peak, the Gatlin brothers embodied a version of country music that was confident, accessible, and unapologetically mainstream. They dominated award shows, appeared regularly on television, and enjoyed sustained chart success. Yet, that same mainstream identity later worked against them. As country music shifted in the mid-1980s, polished harmony groups fell out of favor. The industry pivoted toward edgier narratives and solo personalities that felt more marketable to changing demographics. The decline was not immediate, but it was decisive. Radio airplay slowed. Labels redirected attention. The Gatlin brothers' sound, once celebrated for its refinement, was suddenly dismissed as outdated. Larry Gatlin, deeply involved in songwriting and production, felt the shift acutely. Unlike artists who chased reinvention, he chose distance. In the late 1980s, Larry Gatlin stepped away from the industry, citing personal struggles and disillusionment with Nashville's changing priorities. When he returned years later, the spotlight had moved on. The legacy of the Gatlin brothers became frozen in a specific era, rarely discussed in contemporary country conversations. Today, Larry Gatlin is often remembered as part of a group rather than as a defining creative force. His songwriting achievements and influence are overshadowed by the perception of the Gatlin brothers as a relic of a bygone sound. Larry Gatlin did not disappear because his music lost value. He disappeared because the version of country he represented was quietly written out of the genre's ongoing story.